Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for an Olana webinar. I'm Gracie Mills, Education Manager at the Olana Partnership. Before we get started, I just want to give a special thanks to you all for joining us here on Zoom, especially to our members whose continuous support is a vital part of what makes programs like this possible at the Olana Partnership. You can become a member or learn more by visiting olana.org/membership. We have numerous upcoming public programs and events this season, and you all can learn more at olana.org/programs-events. Our program this evening is being hosted in conjunction with our exhibition, Terraforming Olana's Historic Photography Collection Unearthed, an exhibition of Church's own historic photographs on view until October 29th. Visit our website to book a time to take a tour of the exhibition before the end of the month. Our next winter exhibition, Spectacle, Frederic Church and the Business of Art, will open on November 19th, and we'll be kicking off that show with another webinar with art historian Catherine Manthorn discussing the relationship between finances and fine art in Church's painting Heart of the Andes. That is on November 15th. Lastly, mark your calendars for Saturday, December 16th for our winter solstice celebration here at Olana. There will be a bonfire, musical performance, art making, games, and delicious hot drinks for all to enjoy. Now, before we get started, a few notes on Zoom. As an attendee, your sound and video will remain off throughout this webinar. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions of our speakers. You are welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar, but we will not answer them until the final portion of the program. You can move our speaker's image during the talk if the image is covering the PowerPoint by clicking the black bar above their picture and dragging it. If you're having any issues with your Zoom today, please contact me, Gracie Mills, at gmills@olana.org. I will also be available for troubleshooting in the chat function. Now, please join me in welcoming the moderator for tonight, Allegra Davis, the Olana Partnership's Associate Curator, who will be introducing tonight's speaker.
Thank you so much, Gracie, and thank you again to everyone for joining us virtually for another Olana webinar. I'm so excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Corey Keller, who will be taking us on a tour of the 19th century world of photography and its collection and production throughout Frederic Church's milieu. Corey Keller is an independent curator and historian of photography based in Oakland, California. She recently stepped down as curator of photography and acting head of the photography department at SF MoMA, where she was a member of the curatorial team from 2003 until 2021. She's currently at work on a book about Anna Atkins, who we'll be learning about tonight, and teaching at the California College of the Arts. Corey also contributed an essay to the catalog accompanying our current exhibition, also titled Terraforming Olana's Historic Photography Collection Unearthed. And that catalog is now available in the Olana Museum shop. So to learn more, please go and check that out after tonight's webinar. But for now, I'm very happy and excited to turn it over to Corey.
Thanks, Allegra. I really am so grateful to be here. Hi to everyone. Thank you all for coming this evening. Still afternoon here in California, but I appreciate you spending your evening with us. I will put in a plug for this wonderful terraforming book. It's really terrific and it was a lot of fun to work on. I was very grateful for the invitation to participate. One of the things as a a historian of 19th century photography is you're always excited when you learn about something you had no idea about, which happens with alarming frequency. But in this case, when I was invited to write about Church's photography collection, my first thing was, Church collected photography? How do I not know this? So it was really a wonderful opportunity to kind of dive into this body of work that I didn't know about, and to get to share my research with you. So I'm going to see if we can do this. I'm going to share my screen. With any luck, this will work. There we go. So we'll just start here with Mr. Church himself. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised that Church was interested in photography. He was, as we know from his paintings, keenly attuned to the issues of his time. And he was 13 years old when photography was invented. So you can imagine that a 13-year-old would have been pretty interested in this new technology, which really radically changed image making in the 19th century. So as an image maker, he would have been interested in that as well. If he was 13 when it was invented, by the time he was sort of at the height of his painting career, photographs were being made in the United States and sold in the millions annually. So it was a booming industry, and it was had a dramatic effect on how pictures were looked at and made in this period. It also intensified a lot of the debates that would come to shape Church's own approach to painting, including the relationship between art and science, between nature and representation, and about the sort of proper relationship of the detail to the overall whole. We're really only just beginning to understand the importance of Church's collection. This was sort of a first foray into really thinking about what it might have meant to Church. Here you can see a portrait of him made by Matthew Brady, who is one of the most important portrait photographers and Civil War photographers in the United States. So clearly he knew what was what in the photography world. He knew where to go for his portrait. Brady was about as good as you could get. But we know from the size of the collection that it was important to him. That much is obvious. The pictures we're going to talk about tonight are what we might call travel photography, but they make up about 2,000 photographs. So it's a very substantial collection. So we know that he was interested, but it's not 100% sure what the interest was. But in any case, given the size of the collection, it seems obvious that we need to take it seriously when we're thinking about Church's life, the way he made pictures, and the way consuming pictures shaped the way his pictures were both made and received. So like I said, the pictures that we're going to talk about tonight, sort of the bulk of his collection, which we might loosely call, for lack of a better term, travel photographs. They span about 50 years, from about 1850 to the end of the 19th century. And they range from the unique, there's a wonderful daguerreotype by Babbitt of Niagara Falls from the 1850s, all the way to the end of the 19th century, to the kind of mass-produced albumin prints and stereo views that were made in the thousands in the 19th century. And they also cover a pretty astonishing range of the globe, all the way from the icebergs of the Arctic to the jungles of India, the deserts of the Holy Land, to the archaeological sites of Mexico, like you see here. So it's a pretty comprehensive collection, both in terms of scope, physical scope, and global scope, which is really interesting. And the collection includes works by names who we still know today, would consider sort of the great makers of photographs in the 19th century, to people whose names we no longer know. So it's a very interesting window into sort of what was produced during the 19th century. One of the things we can see when we look at his photographs is there's a real overlap in subject matter between the places he collected photographs of and the places he made paintings of. But to date, only 2 paintings in his body of work have ever been linked to a specific photograph. I think it's 2. It's in any case, it's a very small number. So what we do know is that he doesn't seem to have used photographs as a kind of sketch a sketching tool, as many, many painters did in the 19th century. Everyone from Delacroix to Atkins to Sargent were using photographs, either ones they made themselves or they commissioned, as a sort of fast way of making lots of sketches. But Church doesn't seem to have used them in such a direct way. And I thought that these are two beautiful photographs from an album of pictures made in the Arctic. And these are actually photographs that were commissioned by the painter, William Bradford, to use for his paintings. But in the end, they decided that the photographs were so beautiful that they published them as an album, a standalone album in 1873. But this is a really good example of the way painters often used photography. In this case, Bradford went on an expedition to the Arctic to make his own observations, and he hired two photographers to accompany him to make photographs that he could later use when he was back in his studio making paintings. But Church does not seem to have worked in that way. Here's an example on the left, his painting El Casne from Petra, and on the right, a photograph from Church's collection. This is El Deir, which is near El Casne. It's not the exact same building, but the pictures that he has of El Casne have a sort of similar, straightforward, descriptive sense to them. And you can see that in his painting of El Casne, he's chosen to paint it as you encounter the monument from a rock canyon that was sort of the approach to this landmark. So Church has included lots of beautiful details in his rendering of El Casne, but the dominant feeling of the painting is that of emerging out of this dark cavern into the light of discovery, of kind of mystery. And you can see in the photograph, for example, that it's really quite straightforward. It's descriptive. It does show the situation of the building within the environment in a beautiful way, but it's more, I would say, workmanlike and less interpretive. So I would say that what Church's photographs show is clearly important. I also think it's worth thinking about the collection of reflecting his sort of particular attitude toward collecting in general. And since I know a lot of you are Olana fans, I'm assuming many of you have been to the house itself. And anybody who's been to the house itself can testify to Church's passion for collecting objects. These pictures are ones the Olana staff sent to me. And actually, my experience of being in that room was it felt even more sort of chaotic and full of things. He and his wife traveled widely, and they sent home crates and crates of artworks and furniture and objets and all kinds of things as a way of creating this sort of total artwork out of their house, a kind of space for education and delight. But Church was not alone in his passion for collecting in the 19th century. It became a kind of European and American craze from the very personal scale, like something like what Church did. Church could barely be called a small scale, to places that have now, we would think of like the American Museum of Natural History, the British Museum, the Frick Museum. Those are all the results of collecting either at the personal or the national or even the imperial scale. You see this in science as well. Church, we know, was famously influenced by Alexander von Humboldt, the German scientist who went through South America and collected thousands and thousands of observations and specimens. Charles Darwin of the same period, also, both of their kind of scientific studies were characterized by this kind of collecting, observing, measuring, noting, and bringing back. And this kind of natural history, as science was understood then, was about how to draw these connections between the details of the universe and discern the sort of larger patterns governing the world order. So I think we can see that Church's photography collection is clearly extension of this impulse to collect and to bring back. Church was, we know, an avid traveler, and actually I'm kind of exhausted when you look at his itinerary, given how exhausting it is just like to fly to JFK these days, thinking about the kinds of voyages that he made by steamship and train, it's kind of remarkable that anybody went anywhere in the 19th century. But people did travel, right? And so collecting art as they traveled became a long-standing tradition. In the end of the 17th century, wealthy Europeans on the Grand Tour would make sketches or sometimes commission artists to make pictures of things they saw. By the 18th century, they could buy like engravings like this Piranesi of the famous views that they would have seen on the Grand Tour, which, culminates in Rome. And you can see on the left, these Baedeker travel books. But by the time the sort of 1820s roll around, there's enough improvement in travel, starting with the introduction of the steamboat on the Rhine in Germany, and then about 10 years later, transatlantic steamship crossing. So travel starts to become open to a lot more people. And by the 1870s, it became really, I'm not going to say accessible, but much more widely accessible. Traveling was no longer the province only of the ultra wealthy or the sort of European elite. And because there had been this tradition of buying artwork, souvenir views as you traveled, the photographers sort of immediately latched onto this existing tradition. And they set up photographic studios all along the traveler's trail from London to Cairo. And as travelers went, they could buy photographs along with maps or engravings or other things. And so Church did this as well. And in fact, what was quite fun was to see that the Baedeker guide that he had in his library recommended a specific photographer in Rome, and Church actually bought quite a lot of pictures from that photographer. Whether it was on Baedeker's recommendation or not, I don't know. But most of the guides would tell, that was always something like, where do you find the English-speaking pharmacist? Where do you find a drawing teacher? And where do you buy engravings and photographs? Those were always things that were listed in a 19th century travel guide. So here you have two beautiful views by unknown photographers of some of the most famous monuments of Rome. And I always love that they include these figures in them as a way sort of that the viewer could kind of imagine themselves there. They're not necessarily like now we would want ourselves in the picture, but barring that in the 19th century, you could have these kind of substitute figures that give both a sense of scale of the monument, but also a kind of placeholder for you to imagine yourself there. For those people who couldn't actually physically travel, you had stereo views, and Church had a number of stereo views in his collection. The sort of burgeoning travel industry sparked a burgeoning armchair travel industry as well. And this sort of really took off with the birth of the stereo view in the 1860s. And here you can see, this is a stereo card advertising stereo views, but it's essentially two nearly identical photographs. It's taken with a camera whose lenses are sort of eye distance apart. And then when you view you take the card and you put it in a special viewer, like the one in this advertisement here, and the two pictures resolve into one that looks, I wouldn't say naturally three-dimensional, it looks sort of uncannily three-dimensional, but people at the time described it as feeling like they were actually there on the spot. Here's an example of one of the Underwood, which was the largest producer of these kinds of views. And you could buy them all through the 19th century, and they were produced in the hundreds of thousands of almost any region of the world. And in fact, there were clubs where people would go on trips from their living room, where you could buy a guided tour of a place in the world, and you would slip the different appropriate views into your viewer and feel as if you were there. But this idea of the photograph as a substitute for experience will become important as we go on. And that was the way people talked about it was that you didn't even need to leave your house, or you didn't even need to keep the monument. If you had photographed it, you could lose the monument altogether, because once you had it well photographed, no longer needed the original. I know it's hyperbolic, but that's the kind of language that they were using sort of in the 1850s and 60s to talk about photography. Church's collection includes some extraordinary works by noted photographers. One is William James Stillman, who actually was Church's painting student, and then later sort of turned his back on Church and his teaching. But Stillman was a journalist who went on to become a diplomat and spent some time in Athens photographing the Acropolis. One of the reasons it's interesting to look at pictures from the 19th century is, we come to it with our, eyes. We have our own biological eyes, but we maybe can't read them the way that they were read at the time that they were made. One of the things that Stillman has done in his pictures of the Acropolis is to sort of preserve the evidence of the German archaeologists who were working at the Acropolis at the time. And what you don't ever see are the Greek archaeologists who were working on the site. And there was this kind of competition of worldviews. The Greek archaeologists were sort of positing the Parthenon and the Acropolis as a sort of a heritage to modern Greeks, whereas the European, Greece is in Europe, but the Northern Europeans didn't think of the Greeks as European. But let's say the French and the English and the German looked at the Greek architecture as the sort of cradle of European civilization. And so they were sort of telling a different story with these kinds of pictures. And that's one of the things that I think is hard, maybe when we look at 19th century pictures, maybe they just look kind of old, or we think we can read them because we can look at them. But there's these stories like this that they're telling a story as well that would have been important at the time. So Stillman's extraordinary photographs of the Parthenon are also telling a story about European civilization and the history of archaeology. Similarly, Church collected photographs of what was then known as the Holy Land, and many of those photographs were made by either made by photographers who ascribed to these beliefs or were hired by organizations like the Palestinian Exploration Fund, this idea that they were looking for archaeological evidence of the Bible, essentially. As you can imagine, things like Darwin's theories of evolution and other scientific theories like the fossil record threw a lot of ideas into up in the air about how old the world was, the reality of the Bible. And there was a lot of interest on the part of various Christian organizations to using photography for finding sort of evidence of biblical theories. This particular picture I happen to love because it's the only one I've ever seen of this view. This is the place that I think the Christian theology calls the Valley of Judgment. And supposedly the whole world is supposed to fit in there. But you can see the tombs that look like rocks scattered across. And the tomb of Absalom is there at the lower left. And the tomb that used to be called the Christians called it the tomb of St. James. But I think it's Zechariah, actually. Anyway, there's a lot of this kind of work which aligned with the Church's own religious beliefs. Now, one of the things that's interesting that we can know about what Church was thinking is how he organized the pictures. So we know from the size of the collection that this was a very important activity for him. And we can also tell from the way he organized his pictures a little bit of what he might have been doing with them. Traditionally, people who collected photographs as they traveled would often mount them into albums. You could take them to a professional album maker and they would make you an album, or other people would paste them into their own albums. And here you're looking at pages from Isabella Stewart Gardner's travel albums, Egypt and Sudan above, and on the right is from Japan. And these are in the collection of the museum that she founded, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And you can see here that she's annotated them by hand. She made her own albums. She's included drawings. There's other kinds of material in them. And they essentially serve as a kind of record of what she saw as she traveled, almost like a pictorial diary of where she went and what she saw. Church didn't do that. Church organized his pictures mostly by subject matter, and he left them loose, mostly unbound, in portfolios by subject or geography. So essentially, he's kind of built himself a reference library or a pictorial atlas, I think. So that's quite different from, that also sets him apart from sort of typical travel photography collectors. And I was interested to know, if he was at all influenced by the Boston Athenaeum, where he had shown his work. And the Boston Athenaeum was one of the first places in the United States that began collecting photography in this way. They had a sort of study room where you could see prints and maps and sculpture. And by the 1850s, you could see photographs. And it was like a picture library, essentially, where you could look up pictures by topic. And it was meant to be used by artists, by architects who are looking for pictorial reference material. And so to a certain extent, that's what Church built for himself, his own kind of pictorial library, which is very interesting. It's also important that not all of the photographs in Church's collection are of places that he visited. While he bought many of them, on site, he also clearly ordered many of them from other places. And one of the treasures of this collection is the beautiful album or portfolio by Desiree Charnay. I had to include a picture of him because I thought his mustache was quite, and his hair was quite dashing. Charnay was a school teacher, actually. He was teaching in New Orleans, and he read a book whose name has just gone right out of my head, but it was about the archaeological sites of Mexico. And he decided that he was going to go to Mexico and make photographs. So first he went back to Paris and learned how to make photographs. Then he went to Mexico and carrying, just to get a sense of this is kind of what photographic equipment looked like in the 19th century. So he's carrying 1,500 pounds of equipment through Mexico. And many of these sites had become densely overgrown. I think you can see here in this one at Chichen Itza, there's trees growing on top. But he worked with teams of people, and they used machetes and they cut their way through the jungle until they bumped right up into the monuments. Oftentimes they didn't know that they were there until they actually walked into them. So these pictures, you could say, are not substitutes for experience in that they're not tourist pictures. Nobody could have gone there. Or very few people could have gone there. Even people who lived in Mexico, they were very difficult to access. But for most Europeans, these were the first photographs that they had seen of these Mayan ruins. And they were kind of like when pictures of the landscape of the American West were shown in the East and in Europe, almost incomprehensible that these things existed. Yeah, so here you can see the kind of equipment that a photographer working with the collodion process, which was most of them after the 1850s, would have carried, both a dark room with all the chemistry because the plates had to be sensitized in the field, as well as a large view camera. Roger Fenton, who photographed during the Crimean War, built himself a little van, but most photographers used a tent like the one you see on the right. Another thing that's really quite spectacular in the collection is these works by Edward Muybridge. If you know Muybridge's photographs, you might have seen his running horse or running the animals in motion. But Muybridge actually photographed on commission many places. And in 1875, he was acquitted after murdering his wife's lover. But he had to kind of get out of San Francisco because even though he was declared innocent, he still wasn't well liked. And so he took a commission to photograph for the Pacific Mail Steamboat Company in Central America. So they wanted photographs of all the places that they served. Muybridge was always kind of a showman. So while he was working in Central America, he changed his name, Edward Muybridge, which wasn't even his name to begin with, to Eduardo Santiago Muybridge for the works that he did in Central America. But this is from Antigua, Guatemala. And again, these are some of the first pictures that were made of Guatemala. And so are historically important, but also they're rather unusual for a collection. The Athenaeum had the complete albums. So I don't know, again, maybe Church has seen them there. One of the fun things about these Muybridge Central America pictures is if you look at a lot of them, you'll start to notice that the sky will begin to look familiar. And that's because 19th century photographic emulsions were not equally sensitive to all the rays of all the colors that are in light. And blue was particularly problematic. So if you exposed for the land, the sky would come out white, overexposed. And so one thing that the photographers did to combat this was to use two negatives, one that was exposed for sky and one that was exposed for everything else. And they often maintained sort of like wardrobes of skies. Muybridge had several skies that he used so that when you print them, they make basically a sandwich of the two negatives so that the two parts of the photograph are equally well exposed. But you will see those particular clouds in a number of Muybridge's photographs because he would reuse the sky negatives in any picture that had a sort of blasted out sky. These are two of pictures in Church's collection that I like particularly, in part because I think that they're so kind of modest in what they depict. And to me, they also talk a little bit about some of the ideas that belonged to photography in the 19th century. One of them was this idea of nature drawing her own picture. I know it when we all make pictures all the time now, so perhaps some of these ideas just seem so foreign and strange. But when photography was invented in 1839, there was a lot of debate or confusion about where photographs sort of came from. What kind of a picture was made by a machine and not by an artist's hand? They often showed more than a person on the site could see. And sometimes even you could look at a photograph with a magnifying glass and see even more detail. So they sort of provoked confusion. They're a kind of picture. They're made by a machine. They look very much like the thing that they depict. And so there was this idea that a photograph was some kind of unmediated picture that is sort of passed directly from the world right onto the photographic negative. And the language they use again was nature drawing her own picture. And so as a result, there's this kind of conflation that happens between the photograph and the thing that the photograph represents. And they often use the same kind of language to describe both. I would call them sort of specimens. So this idea that the photograph and the thing the photograph is of are exchangeable became part of this idea that in collecting photographs, you were also collecting the world itself. I think we still talk about photography a little bit this day. Like most people, when they look at a photograph, think about it as what is a photograph of, as if the photograph itself is just a clear window that we look through onto the world. But that idea was really sort of worried about in the 19th century. Like, what exactly were we looking at? And so I think that that's intersection between photography and collecting in the idea of the specimen helps us to think about Church and his relationship to photography, about art and science, and also a kind of broader approach to collecting the world. So it was in this context that I started thinking about the connection between Church's photography collecting and other kinds of collecting, including botanical collections. And in the 19th century, it became very popular to collect botanical specimens, both as part of a sort of personal education, but also as this part of this larger project of natural history. As many of you know, in 1865, following the deaths of their two young children, excuse me, Frederic and Isabel Church traveled to Jamaica, which was then a British colony. And while Church painted, Isabel collected plant specimens, particularly native ferns, which she pressed into books. And this kind of pressing of plant specimens was a central activity of 19th century botany. This is called an herbarium or herbaria, these kinds of collections of dried pressed plants. Some would be made with single species. Sometimes they were made, I think in this one, it looks like she's combined multiple species in a single picture, which probably tells us she's less interested in them from a like sort of scientific classification point of view than she is in creating a kind of aesthetic assemblage of the foliage of Jamaica. It's beautiful nonetheless, but this became a very popular activity, particularly for women, as we will get to. Isabel also collected live specimens in Jamaica to bring back home, and she established a fern garden at Olana. And if you get the catalog for the exhibition, I would encourage you to read David Hart's essay in there about the fern garden and his intervention into it. It's really quite important as he talks about both the sort of ecological and colonial significance of the Olana fern garden. But in any case, Isabel was hardly alone in, skip one, there we go, in her interest in collecting ferns. The Victorian era witnessed an explosion of interest in ferns. There were many manias in the 19th century. This is before we had Instagram or anything, but somehow these crazes would take off across the country. But this was an international craze, especially in Victorian England, but also in the United States. It had a name, pteridomania, which means literally fern fever. And it became the sort of hunting, cultivating, collecting, pressing, growing ferns became a passion. And so here you see some Australian fern gatherers, and on the right, British fern gatherers. And you can see that it became a kind of romantic activity. Ferns had associations with all kinds of things that Victorians didn't talk about. They grew in damp, warm places. And so the Victorians had ways around, they were quite prudish, but they had ways of making even plants somehow sexy. So fern collecting became this kind of activity. One of the sort of reasons for this explosion of interest was both a growth in interest in gardening, not just for the rich, but for middle classes, particularly urban populations, but also an interest in exotic plants. And the ability to cultivate ferns was a new thing in the 19th century. Ferns, if you've ever tried to grow them, reproduce by spores. They don't have seeds, so they're quite difficult actually to both transport and propagate. But this man named Ward invented a thing that you can see on the right. It's called a Wardian case. It's a glass, it's like a terrarium essentially, that preserves the humidity and the climate that a fern needs to grow. And so all of a sudden it became possible to import ferns. I think there's about 50 kinds of ferns in England, but there are 13,000 kinds of ferns in the world, many of which grew in various parts of the British Empire. So the Wardian case became a way to import ferns back to England or to the United States and to grow them in these large glass houses called ferneries. The Wardian cases were also used in Victorian parlors as a way of bringing nature into the home. And third was the sort of the growth of natural history, that study of nature to discern the patterns that governed it, which it should be understood at this point still referred back to sort of God's great design. So that was sort of the study of nature was a way of understanding God. But botany became a sort of touch point, a sort of intersection between professional and amateur scientists. And the collecting of ferns was particularly associated with women, we'll see. Here, just to give you a sense of like how much fern mania affected. There was, you could get fern ceramics, fern textiles. Here you have a fern bench, fernware decorations. It was really a fern fever. So as I said, botany was one of the few branches of science that was open to women's participation, and it bordered on activities that women were already engaged in, decorating, gardening, and handicrafts. And pressing plant specimens into books was a kind of polite activity that provided gentle outdoor exercise as well as an educational benefit. Women were not expected to make actual contributions to new knowledge. For much of the 19th century, botany was based on the Linnaean system, which was first done in Latin, which, with very few exceptions, was taught only to boys. And second, the system was based on the classification system was based on the sexual reproduction of plants. So it was about their sex organs, which women were definitely not supposed to be talking about. But ferns and seaweed fall into a separate class of plants because they both reproduce asexually. So in addition to a fern fever, there was also a seaweed fever. And much of this sort of provided a way of sidestepping the problem of teaching women about sexual reproduction and allowing them to participate in botany. But what's been less discussed, I think, in the history of science is how much women, even though they weren't making new discoveries, contributed essentially to 19th century science by doing what we would today call field work. Scientists like Charles Darwin or William Hooker, who was the director of the Royal Botanical Garden, could not have done their work without the women who sent them specimens, either voluntarily or were even commissioned to find specimens. Wives of colonial governors were also often pressed into service of science and encouraged to collect specimens and send them back. So both Hooker and Darwin maintained voluminous correspondence with just regular women who collected specimens for them in the field. All of which sort of brings me to this work. I was talking about Anna Atkins. I'll just talk about it for a few minutes, and I can answer questions if you're interested. You may have heard of Anna Atkins if you're interested in the history of photography, as she's the publisher of the first photographically illustrated book about British algae. But her sort of second body of work was about ferns. And one of the things that's interesting me about Atkins is I've been finding that as historians try to introduce more women into the canon of history, which they absolutely should be doing, one of the things that they have done often is to try to make women seem just as important as the masters of the medium. And so as a result, they often sort of downplay the way gender affected the work that they did. And I feel that now Atkins has been pretty well established in her seat in the history of photography. I mean, for a long time, William Henry Fox Talbot was given the authority for having done the first photographically illustrated book, but Atkins' book beats his by several months. So now we've established her as the author of the first photographically illustrated book. I think it's time to look at the way gender both shaped and limited her work, but also the way she was sort of able to work within the boundary of gender expectations to create something rather extraordinary. So here you see the frontispiece and a section text for an album she made of British and foreign ferns and also flowering plants. So these are rather decorative, as you can see, not meant to be scientific, but rather beautiful. Here's a picture of Atkins. She's 62 in this picture, but she was in her 50s or late 40s when she actually began making, she was 40 when photography was invented. So Atkins is a really interesting figure because she's both typical and exceptional. She's exceptional in that she was a motherless daughter to a scientist who raised her at home. And so as a result, she had a kind of front row seat to all of the developments in modern Victorian science. And many of those people came to her house, and her father educated her in science in a way that most young girls did not get educated. So she had access to a scientific education and access to some of the people who would become incredibly important in the history of photography. In this case, John Herschel being most important, who invented the cyanotype process, which is what you see here, these blueprint. It's the basis for the architectural blueprint. It was a fairly simple, from chemical terms, early photographic process that involved coating a piece of paper with the chemistry, placing the object on the paper, exposing it to sunlight, and simply washing the paper in water. If you ever bought a Sunprints pack at a museum, you've made a cyanotype. And so Atkins learned about the new photography method from some of the inventors of it, which is that makes her definitely extraordinary. And she chose to make a photographically illustrated book about seaweed. So this is pretty interesting. So she chooses a topic that would be considered appropriate for women, the collecting and pressing of seaweed, and she uses her seaweed specimens to make what is essentially an herbarium, much like what Isabel Church made. But in this case, multiple copies can be made because it's photographic instead of the actual plant, and could be distributed to multiple recipients. We may appreciate them now for their absolute beauty, but here, her primary sort of interest was in making drawings in which the specimen drew itself. She also worked with ferns, as I mentioned before, and here you can see two of the ferns from her album that we saw the frontispiece to. And again, she's making sort of scientific specimens of ferns, where she's, sorry, my husband is waving to me at the window. It's very distracting. She's making scientific illustrations of ferns. And what's interesting is you can see where these ferns come from. One is from Jamaica and one from Ceylon, both British colonies. And Atkins's fortune, actually, when she married, her husband owned coffee plantations in Jamaica. So there's this kind of interesting connections that happen between science, empire, colonialism, that I think tie back again to some we were talking about earlier with Church. But the Atkins work is just, to me, fascinating. I love when you have a figure who has sort of been well established in the history, and then you can take a new look at her. So what I'm looking at is the way gender sort of shaped the choices that she made, but that she worked within sort of these expectations that a woman would work with botany, that she would work specifically with seaweed and with ferns, to make something that is a landmark in the history of photography, the first photographically illustrated book, which was her book of algae, which she began in 1843, and made thousands and thousands of cyanotypes illustrating the types of seaweed that you could find in the United States. So I'm going to stop there, I think, and maybe we can open it up to questions. I'm sure there's a lot I didn't cover, but I'd be interested to hear if people had questions. So maybe we'll do that, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Corey, for that fantastic, fascinating overview. Please, to the audience, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box. And we have about 10 minutes here to read through. We already have a few questions coming in, but I just wanted to start off with one that came to mind as we were talking about how Anna Atkins was both working within gendered expectations and restricted by them, how that informed her practice. Over the course of working on this exhibition, we discovered that the historic library at Olana contains some wonderful DIY guides to photography dating throughout the 19th century, the earliest one from the 1850s. But there is one from 1887 I just pulled up to confirm the date. So getting on into the later years of the 19th century, that contains a wonderful and horrifying chapter called Photography for Ladies, and is explaining how this new technology makes photography accessible for women. So I was wondering if you had a little more insight on how the changes to photographic technology during Church's lifetime was making photography more accessible to women as an art form. Did that change how it was viewed as an acceptable activity? Or is this maybe also a product of just changing, evolving social mores as we get into those later years?
I think it's a little bit of each. I mean, in 1888, Kodak puts out their first amateur camera, and their slogan is, you press the button, we do the rest. And basically it was a camera preloaded with film, and you took your pictures and then you mailed the whole camera back to Kodak, and they would take the film out and process it, reload the camera and send it back to you. But they had a whole line of advertising that just so simple, even women and children could do it. And in fact, the blueprint that Atkins used so beautifully never really caught on during the 19th century, except for technical and illustrative purposes. But by the end of the 19th century, there was a large amateur market for photographic materials. And so the blueprint was marketed almost not because of Atkins. Atkins, by this point, everyone had forgotten about her, but because it was so easy. I mean, if you've made a sun print in a museum, like one of those little packets, you know how easy it is. So basically they were selling sun print kits, and they were marketed exclusively to women. So as a result, the blueprint had a kind of bad reputation for quite some time, because it was either for architects or it was for women. And now we're seeing a whole generation of contemporary artists who are really interested in how it can be used and all the meanings that are attached to it. But it had a good 100 years of where, it was really kind of not very respectable.
And that really, I love seeing that turn in contemporary art now towards looking at these sort of disparaged media, things that were written off as craft and women's work being really, or decorative arts all being taken seriously and reinterpreted. That flows very nicely to one of our first questions coming up here. Zach Karpinski asks, do you know of any current artist botanists who are still creating these types of photographs and collections similar to Atkins?
There are, like Terry Evans has made these beautiful photographs. She's a Chicago-based, Chicago area photographer, has made these beautiful pictures of the herbarium in the Field Museum that are quite spectacular. There are a lot of contemporary photographers who are working with the cyanotype and who were directly influenced by Atkins's work. Megan Riepenhoff is she was in the Bay Area. She's now in Bainbridge Island, is an artist who's been working with that quite a lot. So there are a number, actually.
Tabitha Soren asks, going back to the 19th century, were there any other women besides Anna Atkins making photographs in the US that we know of, whose names come to us today? Why do we know about her work but not other women? And could she really have been the only woman doing this in a serious way in her time?
100% she was not. And that's what's really interesting. I mean, she'd become, I would say in the very early days, the women who were making photographs were largely in a position of privilege. So, for example, Atkins she grew up in a wealthy family, and then she married a wealthy husband. And so most of the very early photographers were photographers of leisure, shall we say. But there are many more than we know about. I mean, one of the difficulties with Anna Atkins, for example, is she signed her work AA. And so for a long time, people didn't even know what that meant. mean, if you think, but that was very common. Jane Austen's novels were never published under her name during her lifetime. So even it was always, by the author of Pride and Prejudice or by the author of Sense and Sensibility. Her name never appeared. No one knew she had written those books till after she died. So it was very common, even for women who managed to breach that kind of boundary between the private, which was woman's world, and the public, which was the man's world, for them to do it in anonymity. But we're learning every day about new ways women participated in photography. And I know there's a dissertation coming out of the UK that's kind of blow that open. So yeah, we know about Anna Atkins because whenever somebody does something first, we tend to recognize them in our histories. But it deserves more unpacking.
Sounds like we have a lot of great new information to look forward to.
There's lots of work to do. It's good.
There's lots of questions about Anna Atkins coming in. I think this connection of ferns and photographs is really our nexus here. It's really capturing our imaginations. But we have a couple questions addressing, were Atkins and Church in any way running in the same artistic circles? Did any way they could have known each other? One question in particular from Sean Sawyer, were Anna Atkins and Marianne North, the British botanical painter, who was a friend of the Church's, acquainted with each other?
I don't know. We don't know very much about Atkins' life. This is also one of the challenges of writing women's history, is that their writings, even if they kept journals or letters, were often not preserved, right? Because they weren't public figures, whereas the men's are all cataloged in the British Library and you can search them online. Women, so we don't have much record of Anna Atkins. What we do know of her biography is all about her father's life. She wrote a memoir, a biography of her father. So I know a lot about the scientific people who came in and out of the house. That being said, she was a member of a botanical society, and so would have gone to lectures and exhibitions, and botanical illustration was hugely popular at that time, and much of it was done by women. So I don't know if she knew specifically North's work, but she would have been familiar with other botanical illustrators.
She certainly would have been exposed to the sort of the company and society where Marianne North's work could have been viewed. Peter Wang asks, would you speak more about the connection between the greenhouse and colonialism and how they intersect with the history of photography in the 19th century? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's an extraordinarily, I had never really considered, for example, in thinking about Atkins' work, the fact that in her fern collection, for example, the ferns come from all over the world, but it's not exactly all over the world. It's all over the British Empire. And so that this idea that one could sort of exercise intellectual dominion over places that one also exercised political dominion became very closely tied, but I had never heard it really discussed in relationship to Atkins' work. And then the fact that her husband's money came from these coffee plantations in Jamaica. And although slavery was abolished in 1807, the slave trade was abolished in 1807 in Jamaica, it wasn't until the 1830s that the plantations had to stop using enslaved people as laborers. So, the money for those, especially in Britain, for people who were well-to-do and could take up things like photography as hobbies, came from someplace, and it's not always so pretty when you turn over the rocks to find out where that money came from. So that was something I really had to, it's a terrible feeling when there's someone you admire very much and you think their work is extraordinary, and then you have to look at where the money comes to finance that. And so, but yeah, that collecting, people, they collected things from all over. The British Museum is full of things that people collected from Egypt. And the fern collection was no less a part. It was very interesting because it had this counterpart in Britain, British ferns. So there was this kind of nationalism around it. And in fact, it was such a mania that I think 2 kinds of British ferns went almost completely extinct because they collected so many specimens. So you have this kind of British fern collecting, and then you have collecting from the places that are under imperial control. So there's this very interesting kind of, I think, intellectual and scientific kind of colonialism that parallels the political colonialism.
I definitely see that with the church's impulse as well to, cast the eye over the known world and bring back some evidence of all of that. And I mean, to speak of Marianne North as well, I mean, going to every continent except Antarctica, essentially, and assembling it all back in her self-designed gallery. It's such a fascinating time of this newly connected world to dig into, but certainly all kinds of underpinnings to acknowledge there. I'll just gonna squeeze in one more question here as we hit 7 o'clock. Victoria Johnson asks, I was just reading an 1857 article in the art journal The Crayon, which William James Stillman was the founder of, I believe. And there was a scathing critique of photography as vulgar and democratic because it captured whatever the light fell upon first. In what ways and when did American painters begin to accept photography as an art form?
That's a good question. I like that you just happened to be reading The Crayon just the other day, but yeah, so like that's part of this whole conversation. Absolutely, because in this idea that the world just sort of transposes itself onto the negative, there's no artistic selection being made, right? So this was one of the main criticisms that artists, by which I mean painters, criticized photography, was that there was no, what differentiated just description from art was the exercise of the intellect and the imagination, the discrimination about what to show and what not to show. That's what made it an interpretation, not just a representation. I would say that it wasn't until really the early 20th century that photography was accepted as a fine art. At the end of the 19th century, you start to see these artists like Alfred Stieglitz and his friends, who were what we call pictorialists, who were fighting for photography to be recognized as a fine art. But they did so by making photographs look almost like paintings, very artsy-fartsy, textured, classical themes. And it wasn't until the early 20th century that, actually like second decade of the 20th century, that they sort of staked out a claim for photography as a kind of fine art on its own merits.
And is that perhaps tied in to this moment where even women and children can take photos?
It has to do also with the place of the machine in society. I mean, we always see attitudes towards photography kind of reflect general attitudes around technology in general. But depending on how people are viewing machines, photography tends to go that way as well.
All right. Well, we're a little past our time here, so I will say thank you so much to Corey, and thank you for everyone attending and submitting your fascinating questions. And once again, have a look out for our Terraforming Olana's Historic Photography Collection Unearthed catalog to see 137 of these wonderful images Church collected, and to read more from Corey Keller and the exhibition's curator, David Hart. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful night.